As an English major, it wasn't hard for me to engage with the humanities-based assignment. In fact, on the flight back from Swannanoa, I was ready to start researching traditional songs, George Washington Vanderbilt, the Cherokee Nation, and all the surrounding communities in Asheville. My prior knowledge, however, is what did make it hard. My research and time wasn't one straight path of ideas. In each class I took at Swannanoa, sight I saw, an article I read, I was constantly being challenged with new history that deepened my prior knowledge. So, in order to discuss this topic responsibly, I need you to be open-minded to one central idea. History is not always what it seems. History books can work like a guided tour. Much like the artifacts in a museum exhibit, someone has decided what visitors see first, what is explained in detail, and what is left out. This process can create what I call pseudo-history, false or misleading narratives about real events. Pseudo-history is not always built on outright lies from one person. It can often emerge through selective evidence, euphemisms, or authority given to particular storytellers. Because of this, every historical presentation invites the same questions. Who is telling this story? What source are they using? What might they gain from this version? And perhaps most importantly, what do we have to work harder to see? There is no better way to start this than talking about Unto These Hills. Unto These Hills is the longest-running outdoor historical play written about the Cherokee Nation in 1950 by Kermit Hunter and still performed today. Riley, is that a white man? I'm getting there. The play presents Cherokee history leading up to the forced removal of the Cherokee people in 1838. It was written after the Cherokee Historical Association commissioned an outdoor historical drama that would stimulate tourism in the area. Kermit Hunter then won the commission and wrote the play as a part of his thesis while studying dramatic arts at University of North Carolina. When understanding the background, it can paint a picture that the play was written for economical purposes, and the playwright, Hunter himself, may have not been so concerned about the historical nature of the commission, but the drama component. Now this alone does not disqualify him from writing about Cherokee history. However, it does make the sources and methods behind his writing especially important. Hunter did not build the play primarily around extensive ethnographic interviews with Cherokee people. Instead, he relied largely on existing historical texts, archives, and information provided by the association. The association itself even recognizes the knowledge that has been gained over time, and has rewritten the play in order to maintain its historical accuracy. I also want to mention that more Native people have come onto the association as well. So while this may not disqualify Hunter himself, it does all matter because the play opens by repeating one of the most common myths in European colonization, the claim that the Aztecs believed Spanish conquistadors were gods. Riley, we're talking about Cherokee, not the Aztecs. I know, that is exactly the point. Why would a play about Cherokee history begin with a myth about the Aztecs? Its inclusion demonstrates how easily a familiar colonial narrative can be inherited and repeated, even when it's not directly relevant to the people whose history is supposedly being told. Also, if modern historians have already altered the script as well, how did they miss this too? In Burying the White Gods, historian Camilla Townsend challenges the long-standing claim that the Aztecs believed Hernán Cortés and the Spanish were gods. By comparing Cortés's account with indigenous Natul sources, she argues that many of the stories supporting this myth, including famous omens, do not consistently appear across indigenous accounts. Rather than accepting colonial narratives at face value, Townsend demonstrates the importance of comparing sources before treating them as historical fact. If Hunter and the editors after him inherited and reproduced a colonial myth that modern scholarship has disproven, then we have to ask a larger question. What other assumptions about Native history did they inherit, without recognizing them as assumptions? Again, I'm not arguing that the entire play should therefore be dismissed. I am just saying that we need to continue to question our sources, their framing, and historical context. Without the research and background knowledge, one could be blind to a Native myth that is being reproduced as they attempt to honor and preserve Native life. The original economical intent of the production also creates a complicated situation. Cherokee actors and community members are deeply involved in the performance, and the play contributes to the tourist economy surrounding Cherokee, North Carolina. Ending the production would not simply eliminate a colonial myth. It would also financially harm indigenous performers, workers, artists, and businesses that are currently depend on visitors. It continues to get muddier when you see the pressure placed on indigenous communities within tourist spaces. They may be expected to perform recognizable versions of native identity, because those are the versions visitors know how to purchase. Annette Swannook Clapsaddle, an enrolled citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, describes experiencing this pressure while working in her parents' gift shop as a teenager. She still remembers selling headdresses and tomahawks to visitors, who would sometimes look directly at her and ask, "Where's the reservation?" So the tourist was asking that question while they were already standing in Cherokee country, interacting with a Cherokee person, yet still searching for the version of native life that they had learned to expect. Their idea of a reservation came from images of native people and stereotypes frozen in the past. Clapsaddle argues that these expectations can prevent visitors from recognizing Cherokee culture, even while standing inside it. The Cherokee community is not simply being deceived by the tourist industry, nor does it have complete control over how every visitor interprets its culture. Community members are navigating an economy partly built around outsiders' expectations of what Native history should look like. The choice is therefore not as simple as authenticity versus dishonesty. Rejecting stereotypical products may resist exoticism, but it also means refusing an available source of income. Historical myths do not survive only because people believe them. They can also survive because economic systems and tourist institutions have been built around them. At the Swannanoa gathering, though, I experienced what responsible contextualization could look like. I attended several classes, but I was really interested in my morning course. It was titled Early Abolitionists and Protest Music, and led by Dr. Kathy Bullock. Before we sang, she taught us where the songs came from, who had sung them, and the historical conditions that gave them meaning. One song focused on Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher who led a rebellion against slavery in Virginia in 1831. The song celebrated his resistance, repeating the idea that no one could stop Nat Turner from gaining ground. Historical context was needed to sing the song. Without it, the song loses its original intent, to educate and preserve the resistance of enslaved people in slavery, in a society that has continuously silenced, condemned, and forgotten that resistance. It is also important that I learned this from a Black woman who treated the song as a living narrative rather than entertainment. This encouragement to dive deeper into the art that we see is what I was hoping from Unto These Hills. Unlike Hunter, the intent behind the art was not to entertain, but to preserve a deep part of history. Dr. Bullock taught me that responsible interpretation does not separate art from the conditions that it was produced in. It gives the audience information that is necessary to understand what they're hearing before asking them to enjoy it. So before I take you to Black Mountain College, I should also let you understand that part of its history. Founded in 1933, the college is best remembered by its progressive education, and as Amanda Fortini in her own article describes, free-spirited students. Its founders rejected many traditional academic structures like formal grades, and students were encouraged to use hand-on experience to guide themselves through their own learning. However, while it's easy to romanticize one of these colleges and the academic liberation that it had, Amanda Fortini in her article too warns romanticizing the progressive education that was once claimed. The institution has had its own struggles too. Some faculty members opposed admitting Black students because they feared the reaction of the surrounding community. The college admitted its first Black summer student in 1944, and its first full-time Black student the following year. But attracting Black students remained difficult in the segregated South. As Fortini concludes, Black Mountain remained trapped in its historical moment, despite its progressive ideals. This does not erase the college influence. It complicates it. Black Mountain College can be celebrated for transforming American art education while still being examined for the limits of its progressivism. Remembering only its famous artists and experimental freedom would repeat the same mistake I noticed elsewhere in Asheville. allowing the most attractive version of history to become the complete version. Responsible historical interpretation must preserve achievement and contradiction at the same time. Like the area around it, the Biltmore struggles to achieve that responsible interpretation. It is hard to claim that the Biltmore is not gorgeous. The scale of the estate itself makes it easy to become absorbed into the labyrinth of rooms. Moving from room to room, you can see the extreme wealth of the Vanderbilt family. Yes, those are two original Monets. The numbers alone are overwhelming. After being fully finished in 1895, the Biltmore covered 170,000 feet and contained over 250 rooms. In Vicky Ward's paper dissecting the novel The Last Castle by Denise Kernan, she describes George Vanderbilt as an inheritor, or as I say, Nepo baby. Look, George did not earn the fortune that funded him the estate. He was just instead lucky to be the wealthiest grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the true entrepreneur who generated much of the fortune through ferries, railroads, and steamships. George ended up being a moocher who built the mansion as a vanity project, intended to outdo the other members of the Gilded Age high society. However, wealth on that scale does not exist independently. Every bedroom, dining room, hallway, garden, meal, and decorative object depended on human labor. The Biltmore did not completely erase its workers. Information about domestic servants and laborers appeared throughout parts of the tour, but it was the structure of the experience itself that shaped how much attention the history received. The grand rooms belonging to the Vanderbilt family were shown at the beginning and center of the tour. The worker spaces, including the maids' rooms and cleaning areas, appeared closer to the end. By the time I reached them, I had already walked the halls and stairs of each floor. I was tired and ready to sit down. The placement of the servants' quarters being last may have resulted from the actual architecture of the building or the practical tour logistics rather than an intentional attempt. However, regardless of why that tour followed that order, from walking the home, I began to sympathize with the servants who scurried in the halls before me. Maybe unintentionally, the curators of the tour made me feel rather than learn the weight the servers held. The organization, though, did not land the same way for everyone. Some of my fellow scholars were too tired to understand the gravity of those spaces. The family story instead is what received my scholars' freshest attention. The workers' story received what remained of it. The workers were present in the estate's history, but their placement made it easier to treat them as an addition to the Vanderbilt story, rather than as people without whom the Vanderbilt story would have not been possible. This is not simply an argument that the Biltmore is evil, or that no one should visit it. Closing the Biltmore would ignore how deeply the estate is now connected to the Asheville economy. Mark Barrett reports that approximately 1.3 million people visit the Biltmore annually. Tourism, more broadly, accounts for approximately 14% of the private employment in the 4 counties surrounding Asheville. The estate is not only a preserved mansion, it's an employer, hotel operator, winery, brand, and economic anchor for the surrounding restaurants, shops, artists, and service workers. This economic importance complicates how its history is preserved. Like unto these hills, the Biltmore supports living workers and surrounding businesses. Criticizing its historical narrative does not require pretending that those people do not depend on it. In fact, that financial dependence is what makes it even more important to examine how history and profit interact. Similar to Townsend's article, Burying the White Gods, Cortez did not invent every element of his narrative from nothing. He selected and organized details in a way that elevated him. Similarly, historical attraction does not have to erase labor completely in order to minimize it. It can include workers while still centering the family that benefited from their work. The history of Shiloh pushed this argument even further. Shiloh was not simply a community that happened to develop near the Biltmore. Its history was directly affected by the estate's construction. John Ross explains that several African American communities formed in South Asheville after the Civil War. Some of their roots can be traced to land from a former plantation that was divided in 1870 to provide homes and a church for formerly enslaved people. George then decided to move the families and cemetery that were already existing into the eastern edge of what became Biltmore Forest. The land did not simply appear out of nowhere. Its creation reorganized the surrounding space and then benefited from the people in those spaces. The estate that tourists now experience as a complete and carefully designed world was produced partly through the relocation of an existing African American community, its church, and its dead. The Shiloh community was not destroyed, but it was physically moved to make room for a Vanderbilt vision. That makes the estates a control over space more than a metaphor. The Vanderbilts occupied the center of not only the tour, but the landscape itself. Shiloh and its laborers being pushed towards the edge. The community has continued to face pressure from businesses and expansion and development. So that's what I want you to take away from this. History is shaped by who's given authority, what is financially valuable, and where information is placed, and how much effort an audience must make to find it. Our responsibility is not simply to reject every imperfect historical account. It is to approach those experiences with enough care to recognize their complexity. Most importantly, I want you to ask, who occupies the grand rooms of the historical narrative, who has been assigned to the servants' quarters, and who has been left outside the tour entirely?